Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the land of bobby pins, bullet bras and behavioural conditioning, the 1950s, where American girls were groomed, moulded and meticulously trained to become the perfect housewives. Not the empowered, independent kind. The kind who smiled while scrubbing toilets, hosted dinner parties with military precision, and never ever questioned why their dreams stopped at the kitchen sink. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your input genuinely shapes the channel and helps it grow. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 AM somewhere. And hey, the channel's now live on Spotify too. Links in the description if you want to check it out there. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe tuck your feet in so the imaginary judgmental aunts can't reach your toes. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was really like growing up female in the 50s? Did girls actually dream of vacuum cleaners and casserole dishes? What would happen if you wanted to be a doctor instead of a doctor's wife? Could you survive home economics class without developing an anxiety disorder? Would you last a day and finish in school, or would you accidentally start a feminist revolution over the proper way to fold a napkin? And how exactly did an entire generation of young women get convinced that their highest calling was to make Jell-O salads and iron their husband's underwear? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1953. You're 14 years old, your hair is in pin curls, your future has already been decided. Good luck. Let's start at the very beginning, literally. You were born into the post-WTO baby boom, a time when America was obsessed with normalcy, nuclear families, and the idea that a woman's place was firmly in the home. From the moment you arrived, pink-swaddled and squealing, your life path was already mapped out. Childhood, high school, marriage, babies, repeat. There were no detours, no alternate routes. You weren't raised to ask questions like, what do I want? You were raised to ask, what does he want? And then deliver it with a smile and a side of mashed potatoes. The war was over, the men had returned, and America was desperate to forget the trauma of the 40s and build something stable, something clean, something aggressively normal. Enter the suburban dream. Houses popped up like mushrooms across the landscape, identical, affordable, filled with modern appliances and the promise of domestic bliss. And at the centre of this dream was you, the future housewife, gestating in a world that had already decided who you'd become. Your birth announcement was pink, your nursery was pink, your baby clothes were pink. Even your toys were colour-coded to remind you, you're not your brother. You're something softer, something quieter, something designed to nurture rather than lead. Your parents didn't mean harm. They genuinely believed they were preparing you for happiness. And happiness, as far as anyone could tell, meant marriage. By the time you could walk, you were already being trained. Don't climb that tree, you'll ruin your dress. Stop shouting, ladies use their indoor voices. Be sweet. Be helpful. Be good. Good didn't mean moral. It meant compliant. It meant pleasant. It meant the kind of girl boys would want to marry someday, and that someday was always lurking, even when you were still learning to tie your shoes. Television reinforced the message. Leave it to Beaver, Father Knows Best, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Every show featured a mother in pearls and heels, cheerfully serving dinner and solving problems with a gentle smile. She never yelled, she never complained, she never seemed to want anything for herself. And you watched her, absorbing the lesson. This is what women do. This is what makes them valuable. School would teach you to read and write, but your real education was happening at home, at church, in the magazines your mother read, in the casual comments from aunts and neighbours. She's going to be a heartbreaker. Better start saving for that wedding. What a lucky man will marry her someday. You were 5 years old, and your future husband was already a ghost in the room, shaping every decision, every expectation, every limitation placed on your tiny life. And the thing is, you didn't question it. Not yet. Because everyone around you, your parents, your teachers, your friends' parents, was singing the same song. The blueprint was clear. The path was set. You were born to be a bride. And if that made you uneasy, if some part of you wondered whether there was more to life than a white dress and a ring, well, you learned very quickly to push that feeling down. Because girls who asked too many questions didn't get happy endings, they got warnings. So you played with your dolls, you practiced being sweet, you learned to smile even when you didn't feel like it, and you waited, without even knowing you were waiting, for the life that had been planned for you before you were even born. Your toys weren't just toys, they were training materials. While your brother got chemistry sets and toy soldiers, you got a plastic kitchen set, a miniature ironing board, and a baby doll that wet itself so you could practice diaper duty. Even playtime was a rehearsal for your future role as wife and mother. The message was clear. Fun is preparation, and preparation is everything. No one gave you a toy briefcase or a doctor's kit unless you were playing nurse to some imaginary male surgeon. You weren't building empires, you were building casseroles. Christmas morning, you tore open the wrapping paper and there it was. A pink plastic oven. Not a real one, of course, but close enough. It had tiny pots, tiny pans and a little light bulb inside that pretended to bake plastic cakes. Your brother got an Erector set. You got an Easy Bake Oven. The divide was clear and no one thought twice about it. You weren't upset. Not yet. Because the oven was fun. You mixed little packets of cake batter with water, poured them into tiny pans and slid them under the light bulb, and when they came out, dry, crumbly, vaguely edible, you felt a surge of pride. You'd made something. You were practicing. You were learning. But here's the thing, your brother's Erector set taught him engineering, problem-solving, spatial reasoning. Your Easy Bake Oven taught you to follow instructions and produce something that would make others happy. His toy pointed outward, toward the world. Yours pointed inward, toward the home. Your dollhouse was the same, beautifully detailed, with miniature furniture, tiny dishes, a little family of plastic dolls. You arranged the furniture, you set the table, you put the mother doll in the kitchen and the father doll in the living room with a newspaper. You were staging a life you didn't even understand yet, but you were learning its rhythms. The mother cooked, the father rested, the children played quietly, everything had its place, and the baby dolls, oh, the baby dolls. They cried, they wet themselves, they needed to be fed, burped, changed, rocked to sleep. You carried them everywhere, cradling them in your arms, whispering to them, practicing the motions of motherhood. No one asked if you wanted children someday. It was assumed, and the dolls were there to make sure you were ready. Meanwhile, your brother was outside, digging holes, catching frogs, building forts out of scrap wood. He came home dirty, scratched, triumphant. You came home with a clean dress and a perfectly swaddled baby doll. He was learning independence. You were learning caretaking. Even board games reinforced the message. Mystery Date. A game where you opened a door hoping to find a handsome boy to take you to the dance. What Shall I Be? A career game for girls with options like teacher, nurse, model and actress. Not doctor, not lawyer, not engineer. Even your imaginary future had a ceiling. If you ever reached for your brother's toys, if you wanted to build with blocks or play with trucks, you were gently redirected. Wouldn't you rather play with your dolls, sweetie? And if you insisted, you might be called a tomboy, which wasn't quite an insult but wasn't quite a compliment either. It was a warning. Don't stray too far from the script. The toy industry knew exactly what it was doing. Advertisements showed girls in frilly dresses smiling as they pretended to cook and clean. Boys were shown in action poses, conquering and exploring. The message wasn't subtle, it was a blueprint, and you absorbed it the way you absorbed language naturally without question, because it was everywhere. By the time you started school, you'd already spent thousands of hours rehearsing domesticity. You knew how to set a table, fold laundry, care for a baby, and bake a cake. You didn't know how to use a hammer, read a map, or fix a bicycle, and that was exactly the point. Your toys didn't teach you to dream big. They taught you to dream small, safely, inside the four walls of a home that didn't even exist yet. And when you finally grew up and found yourself in a real kitchen with a real oven, you'd already spent a lifetime practicing. School in the 50s wasn't just about academics, it was about shaping girls into proper young ladies. Yes, you learned to read and write, but you also learned to sit still, speak softly, and never raise your hand too enthusiastically because that would be unladylike. Teachers praised you for neatness, obedience, and penmanship, not for critical thinking or curiosity. And while the boys in your class were encouraged to explore science and math, you were gently steered toward art, music, and of course home economics, which loomed on the horizon like a flour-dusted inevitability. Your first grade classroom smelled like chalk dust and floor wax. The desks were arranged in neat rows, boys on one side, girls on the other. Even the seating chart reinforced the divide. You learned your ABCs, you practiced writing in perfect cursive loops, and you sat with your hands folded on your desk waiting to be called on. But here's what you also learned. Boys were louder, and that was okay. They shouted out answers. They squirmed in their seats. They got in trouble and laughed it off. You, on the other hand, learned to wait, to raise your hand politely, to speak only when spoken to apologize if your voice got too loud or your opinions too strong. Your report cards praised you for things that had nothing to do with intelligence. She is a delight to have in class. She follows directions beautifully. Her handwriting is excellent. Meanwhile, your brother's report card said things like, he shows great curiosity and he would benefit from more challenges. Curiosity was encouraged in him. In you, it was inconvenient. Math class was where the divide became most obvious. When the teacher asked a hard question, she'd look at the boys. When she needed someone to erase the board or organize papers, she'd look at the girls. The message was clear. Boys were thinkers, girls were helpers, and if you happened to be good at math, if you loved the logic of it, the way numbers fit together like puzzle pieces, you learned quickly to hide it. Because smart girls made people uncomfortable. Science class was even worse. The boys got to do experiments, mixing chemicals, building volcanoes, dissecting frogs. You sat on the sidelines, taking notes, watching, assisting. If you asked to participate, you might be allowed, but you'd also be watched carefully, as if your very presence near a Bunsen burner was somehow dangerous or inappropriate. Art and music, though, those were your domains. You were encouraged to draw, to sing, to express yourself in ways that were soft and decorative. Watercolours, not oil paints. Folk songs, not jazz. Creativity was fine, as long as it stayed pretty, as long as it didn't challenge anything. And then there was sewing. Even in elementary school you started learning to stitch. Embroidery hoops, needles, thread in pastel colours. You made handkerchiefs, bookmarks, little decorative squares that served no real purpose except to teach you patience and precision. The boys didn't sew. They built birdhouses in shop class. You stitched flowers onto fabric and tried not to prick your fingers. Recess was another lesson in its own right. The boys played kickball, dodgeball, tag, games that were loud, physical, competitive. You played hopscotch and jump rope, games that required coordination but never aggression. If you tried to join the boys' games, you were tolerated, maybe, but also teased. You throw like a girl, and you learned slowly that like a girl was an insult, something to be ashamed of. Your teachers weren't cruel. They genuinely believed they were helping you. They thought they were preparing you for a happy life, and in their minds, a happy life meant marriage, children, and a clean house. So they taught you neatness, they taught you obedience, they taught you to be pleasant, helpful, and invisible. By the time you left elementary school, you could read beautifully, you could write in flawless cursive, you could recite your times tables and name all the state capitals. But you'd also learned something else, something quieter and more insidious. You'd learned that your intelligence was secondary to your agreeableness, that your ideas mattered less than your appearance, that your role in life was already decided, and no amount of curiosity or ambition would change it. And so you moved on to middle school, to high school, to home economics class, carrying with you a perfect report card and a growing sense that something was wrong. But you didn't have the words for it yet. So you stayed quiet, hands folded, waiting for someone to call on you. By age 10, you were already learning the basics of beauty maintenance. Your mother handed you cold cream, showed you how to set your hair in rollers, and warned you about the dangers of being plain. Beauty wasn't vanity, it was survival. A pretty girl got a good husband. A plain girl, well, no one wanted to talk about that. You learned that your appearance was your most valuable asset, more important than your grades, your hobbies, or your opinions. So you practiced your smile in the mirror, you learned to walk in heels without wobbling, and you started to understand that being seen was more important than being heard. Your mother sat you down at her vanity one Saturday morning. The surface was crowded with glass bottles, compacts, lipstick tubes, and a silver-backed hairbrush that had belonged to her mother. "It's time you learned," she said, and you nodded, even though you weren't entirely sure what you were learning. She started with your hair. It was long, as all girls' hair was supposed to be, and she showed you how to section it, twist it around pink foam rollers, and pin them in place. You'd sleep in them that night, uncomfortable, lumpy, impossible to rest on, and in the morning you'd have curls. Curls are feminine, she explained. Boys like curls. You were 10. You didn't care what boys liked. But you listened anyway, because this was important. This was your future. Next came skincare. Cold cream to remove dirt and oil, witch hazel to tighten pores, a light dusting of powder to keep your nose from shining. You don't want to look greasy, your mother warned. That's unladylike. You learned that your body's natural state, oily, sweaty, imperfect, was something to be corrected, hidden, managed. She taught you about posture, shoulders back, chin up, stomach in. Walk as if you're balancing a book on your head. Glide, don't stomp. Smile even when you don't feel like it, because a pleasant expression makes you approachable, makes you attractive, makes you marriageable. The lipstick lesson came later, when you were 12. Your mother let you try on her shades, pinks, corals, reds that made your mouth look like a movie star's. Not too dark, she cautioned. Dark lips make you look cheap. There was a whole language of respectability coded into makeup, and you were learning it the way some girls learned Latin. You practiced in the mirror, the smile, the tilt of the head, the way to look at someone without seeming too bold. You learned to soften your gaze, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to make yourself smaller and more decorative. Beauty wasn't just about looking good. It was about performing femininity in a way that made men comfortable. Your friends were learning the same lessons. You compared notes in whispered conversations at sleepovers. Who had started wearing a training bra? Who was allowed to shave her legs? Who had been told by her mother that she was blossoming and needed to start being more careful around boys? There was a paranoia to it, a constant surveillance of your own body and everyone else's. And then there were the beauty magazines. 17, Glamour, Mademoiselle. You devoured them, studying the faces of models who seemed impossibly perfect. Smooth skin, white teeth, tiny waists, bright eyes. You read articles about dieting, about removing unwanted hair, about the best way to apply mascara without clumping. Every page reinforced the same message. You're not enough, but you could be if you just tried harder. The pressure was everywhere. Your mother, your aunts, your teachers, the television, the advertisements, even your father in his own way contributed. "You're getting so pretty," he'd say, and it felt like a compliment, but also like a warning. Pretty was your job, and if you failed at it, what would you be worth? You started to notice other girls, the ones who were called plain or mousy or unfortunate looking. They weren't mean, they weren't stupid, but they were ignored, sidelined, pitied, and you learned, without anyone saying it directly, that this was the worst thing that could happen to a girl. Not being ugly, exactly, but being forgettable, invisible, unmarriageable. So you worked, you curled your hair every night, you scrubbed your face every morning, you practiced walking in your mother's heels, wobbling at first, then finding your balance. You smiled at yourself in the mirror until it felt natural. You learned to be looked at, to be evaluated, to be decorative, and by the time you hit high school you were ready. Not ready to learn, not ready to think, not ready to become yourself. Ready to be seen, ready to be chosen, ready to be pretty enough to secure a future that didn't even belong to you yet. 17. Glamour, Ladies' Home Journal. These glossy magazines weren't just entertainment. They were instruction, manuals. Every article reinforced the same message. Your goal is to get married, and here's how to do it. 10 ways to catch a husband. How to be the girl every boy wants to date. Your wedding day, the most important day of your life. The pages were filled with advice on lipstick shades, diet tips, and how to laugh at a boy's jokes even when they weren't funny. You absorbed it all like gospel, because everyone around you, your mother, your teachers, your friends, was singing the same tune. The magazines arrived every month, slipped into the mailbox like little packets of anxiety wrapped in glossy paper. You tore into them immediately, flipping past the perfume ads and the articles about full fashion to get to the real content. The advice columns, the quizzes, the step-by-step guides to becoming the kind of girl boys noticed. "Are you dateable?" one quiz asked. You answered honestly or tried to, checking boxes about your interests, your personality, your willingness to compromise. The results were always some variation of the same message. Tone it down, be sweeter, laugh more, talk less. If you scored too high, you were intimidating. If you scored too low, you were boring. The sweet spot was narrow, and you were constantly recalibrating. The articles were worse. How to get him to notice you involved strategies that range from practical, sit near him in class, to absurd, drop your book so he'll help you pick them up. You were supposed to engineer chance encounters, manufacture opportunities for him to play the hero, all while appearing completely natural and effortless. It was exhausting. 10 conversation starters for your first date taught you to ask him questions about himself, his hobbies, his dreams, his opinions on sports, movies, politics. You were supposed to listen, nod, smile, agree. The magazines never suggested that he might ask about your interests. That wasn't the point. The point was to make him feel interesting, intelligent, important. You were the audience, not the star. Fashion spreads showed you what to wear, modest but not frumpy, stylish but not too bold, feminine but not overdone. Hemlines were measured, necklines were scrutinized. You learned that your clothes sent messages, and the wrong message could ruin everything. Too much makeup, and you were trying too hard. Not enough, and you were letting yourself go. The margins were impossibly narrow. The diet articles were relentless. Lose 5 pounds before prom. The grapefruit diet that works. How to have a tiny waist like the stars. You learned to see your body as a problem to be solved, a project to be managed. You learned to skip meals, count calories, pinch the flesh on your waist and hate yourself for it. Thin was the goal, thin was the prize. Thin was what boys wanted, and what boys wanted mattered more than what you wanted. And then there were the wedding features. Pages and pages of white dresses, floral arrangements, tiered cakes. The articles assumed you were already planning your wedding, even if you'd never been on a date. They described the perfect day in such detail that you could practically taste the fondant and smell the bouquet. The message was clear. This was the pinnacle of your existence. This was what you'd been working toward since birth. The advice columns were the worst, because they were framed as help, as wisdom from older women who'd been through it all. But the advice was always the same. Accommodate. Compromise. Be flexible. If he's late, forgive him. If he forgets your birthday, don't make a fuss. If he's rude to you in front of his friends, understand that he's just trying to fit in. You are supposed to absorb all his flaws, all his failures, and still smile sweetly, still make him feel like a king. You absorbed these lessons without even realizing it. They seeped into your brain like water into soil, shaping the way you saw yourself, the way you saw boys, the way you imagined your future. Marriage wasn't just a possibility, it was the only acceptable outcome, and if you failed to achieve it, if you ended up unmarried at 25, you'd be pitied, whispered about, quietly mourned as if you'd died. So you read the magazines religiously, you took the quizzes, you memorized the tips, you practiced your laugh, your smile, your tilt of the head listening pose. You learned to make yourself smaller, softer, quieter. You learned to be the kind of girl who didn't threaten, didn't challenge, didn't demand, the kind of girl who waited to be chosen. And the saddest part? It worked. Not because the advice was good, but because everyone was playing the same game. Boys expected you to perform this way. Other girls were performing this way. And so you all moved in lockstep, smiling and dieting and laughing at bad jokes, marching toward the altar like it was the only destination that mattered. Welcome to Home Ec, the class that would define your teenage years. This wasn't an elective, it was mandatory. Here you learned the holy trinity of wifely duties: cooking, sewing and cleaning. You baked bread from scratch, hemmed skirts, and memorized the proper way to set a table for a formal dinner party. Your grade didn't depend on creativity or passion. It depended on whether your biscuits rose correctly and your stitches were even. Meanwhile, the boys were across the hall in shop class, learning to build things and fix engines. You were learning to fix dinner. The classroom smelled like flour, fabric and Lysol. The walls were lined with posters. A clean home is a happy home. Cooking is love made visible. A stitch in time saves 9. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, wore a starched apron and a permanent smile. She was kind but strict. She believed genuinely that she was preparing you for the most important job you'd ever have, being a wife. The curriculum was broken into units: cooking, sewing, cleaning, budgeting, childcare and etiquette. Each one was treated with the same seriousness as algebra or history, because in a way it was more serious. You could fail algebra and still get married, but if you couldn't cook, clean or sew, well, what kind of wife would you be? Cooking came first. You started with the basics: how to measure flour, how to crack an egg, how to fold dough. You baked biscuits, cakes, pies, breads. You learned to follow recipes exactly, never deviating, never improvising. Cooking wasn't about creativity, it was about consistency. Your future husband would expect the same meal, cooked the same way, every single week, and you'd better deliver. You practice making a week's worth of dinners on a budget: meatloaf, tuna casserole, pot roast, fried chicken, spaghetti. The meals were bland, predictable and filling. Flavour was secondary to economy. You learned to stretch a pound of ground beef into 3 meals, to use leftovers creatively, to waste nothing. Your grade depended on staying under budget while still providing nutritious, satisfying meals for a family of 4. The sewing unit was next. You learned to thread a sewing machine, to hem a skirt, to mend a tear, to sew on a button. You made an apron. Every girl made an apron, carefully stitching seams and attaching pockets. Mrs. Henderson inspected each one, checking for crooked stitches, puckered fabric, uneven hems. If it wasn't perfect, you did it again. You also learned to read patterns, to cut fabric, to construct a simple dress. The dress you made was practical, modest, and utterly charmless. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that you could now clothe your future family. Store-bought was for special occasions. Homemade was love. Cleaning was taught with military precision. You learned the proper way to mop a floor. Always start in the far corner and work your way toward the door. You learned to dust, top to bottom, left to right. You learned to scrub a toilet, polish silver, wash windows until they gleamed. Mrs. Henderson quizzed you on cleaning products. Which one for wood? Which one for tile? Which one for glass? You memorized it all because a dirty house was a moral failing. And then came the etiquette unit. You learned to set a table for a formal dinner, forks on the left, knives and spoons on the right, dessert fork at the top. You learned to fold cloth napkins into decorative shapes. You learned to serve food from the left, clear from the right. You practiced walking with a book on your head to perfect your posture. You rehearsed conversations, how to greet guests, how to make small talk, how to be charming without being overbearing. The budgeting unit taught you to manage a household on your husband's salary. You practiced balancing a checkbook, planning grocery lists and calculating the cost of utilities. You learned to prioritize, mortgage first, then groceries, then everything else. There was no line item for your own spending money. That wasn't part of the equation. And finally, childcare. You carried around a sack of flour for a week, pretending it was a baby. You couldn't leave it alone. You had to bring it to all your classes, protect it, care for it. If the sack broke, you failed. It was absurd, but it was also a test. Could you handle the constant, relentless responsibility of motherhood? Because that was coming, whether you were ready or not. Throughout it all, Mrs. Henderson reminded you that these skills weren't just practical. They were essential. Your husband will work hard all day, she'd say. The least you can do is make sure he comes home to a clean house and a hot meal. The least you can do. As if your entire existence was the baseline, the minimum, the bare requirement. The boys across the hall were learning to weld, to use power tools to fix cars. They were building things, creating things, preparing for careers. You were learning to serve. And the divide was so normalized, so accepted, that you didn't even question it. Not yet. Sewing wasn't a hobby, it was a requirement. Every proper housewife needed to know how to mend, alter, and create clothing for her family. You sat at a clunky Singer sewing machine, pumping the pedal and trying not to stab yourself with pins as you stitched aprons, skirts, and eventually baby clothes. The message was clear. You would be responsible for clothing your future family, and you'd better be good at it. Store-bought was lazy. Homemade was love. And if your seams were crooked, well, you'd just have to try harder. The sewing machine sat in the corner of the home ec classroom like a mechanical beast, all black metal and intricate gears. It was intimidating, loud, and unforgiving. You approached it cautiously, lowered yourself onto the wooden stool and stared at the needle, the bobbin, the foot pedal. Mrs. Henderson demonstrated once, threading the needle, winding the bobbin, adjusting the tension, and then it was your turn. You placed a scrap of fabric under the needle, pressed the pedal gently, and the machine roared to life. The needle jabbed up and down, the fabric lurched forward, and before you knew it, you'd stitched a crooked, tangled mess. Mrs. Henderson sighed. Again, she said, and so you tried again, and again, and again, until your stitches were straight, your tension was even, and your seams didn't pucker. Once you mastered the basics, the projects began. First, an apron. Everyone made an apron. You cut the fabric according to the pattern, pinned the pieces together and stitched them carefully. You attached pockets, hemmed the edges and tied the straps. It wasn't beautiful, but it was functional, and that was the point. You weren't making art. You were making utility. Next came a skirt. This was more complicated. You had to measure your waist, cut the fabric on the bias, insert a zipper, attach a waistband. The zipper was the hardest part. It required precision, patience, and a steady hand. If you stitched it wrong, it wouldn't close. If you stitched it crooked, it would pucker. You spent hours hunched over the machine, ripping out stitches and starting over until finally, miraculously, the zipper worked. You modelled the skirt for the class. Mrs. Henderson walked around you, inspecting the hem, the seams, the zipper. She tugged at the waistband, checking for gaps. Acceptable, she said finally, and you exhaled. Acceptable was a victory. But sewing wasn't just about making clothes for yourself. It was about making clothes for your future family. You practiced sewing doll clothes, tiny dresses, little pants, miniature jackets, as preparation for the day when you'd be sewing for real children. You learned to mend holes, patch knees, reinforce seams. Your children will be hard on their clothes, Mrs. Henderson warned. You'll need to keep up. You also learned to alter clothes, how to take in a waist, let out a hem, replace a button, repair a zipper. These were the skills that would save your family money, that would allow you to stretch your husband's paycheck a little further. Thriftiness was a virtue, and sewing was its highest expression. But here's the thing. You didn't particularly enjoy sewing. It was tedious, repetitive, and your fingers were constantly sore from pinpricks. You'd rather have been reading, or painting, or doing literally anything else. But enjoyment wasn't the point. Competence was the point. Duty was the point. Your mother reinforced this at home. She sat you down at her own sewing machine, an older model, even louder than the one at school, and handed you a pile of mending. Torn shirts, missing buttons, frayed hems. "I won't always be here to do this for you," she said. "You need to learn." So you learned. You stitched until your fingers ached. You squinted at tiny needles thread in tiny holes. You ironed seams flat and pinned hems straight. You became competent, then proficient, then skilled. And with every stitch, you absorbed the message. This is your responsibility. This is what makes you valuable. This is love. By the time you graduated high school, you could sew a dress from scratch, mend a hole invisibly, and alter a garment to fit perfectly. You could operate a sewing machine with your eyes closed. You were prepared to clothe your future family, to stretch your household budget, to be thrifty and resourceful and selfless. But you'd also learned something else, that your time, your labour, your creativity were all in service of other people, that your skills existed to support, to serve, to maintain, that you were the seamstress, not the designer, the mender, not the maker of your own life, and that lesson, stitched into you with every seam, would be much harder to unpick. Cooking class was less about food and more about performance. You learned to make meatloaf, tuna casserole, deviled eggs, and the crown jewel of 50s cuisine, Jell-O salad. Yes, Jell-O with vegetables suspended in it. It was horrifying, but it was also expected. You learned to follow recipes exactly, never improvise, and always serve meals on time, dinner at 6, no exceptions. Your future husband's happiness, and therefore your worth, would depend on your ability to keep him fed and satisfied. No pressure. The home ec kitchen was a strange, sterile place. 6 identical stoves, 6 identical sinks, 6 identical countertops, all spotless, all waiting. You and your classmates filed in, tied on your aprons, and opened your recipe books. Today's lesson, meatloaf. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front demonstrating. 1.5 pounds of ground beef, 1 egg, 1 cup of breadcrumbs, ketchup on top. She mixed it with her hands, shaped it into a loaf, and slid it into the oven. Simple, economical, and filling. Every housewife should have a good meatloaf recipe. You copied her movements exactly. You cracked the egg, mixed the ingredients, shaped the loaf, Your hands were cold, greasy, and you tried not to think too hard about what you were touching. The meatloaf went into the oven, you set the timer, you cleaned your station, and then you waited. While the meatloaf baked, Mrs. Henderson moved on to side dishes, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread. Everything was beige or pale green, bland and inoffensive. Your husband will appreciate simple, hearty meals, she explained. Don't try to get too fancy. Men don't like fuss. The next week, tuna casserole, canned tuna, cream of mushroom soup, egg noodles, topped with crushed potato chips. You assembled it like a chemistry experiment, layer by layer, and baked it until it bubbled. It smelled like salt and regret. You tasted it. It was fine. Not good, not bad, just fine. And that was the goal. And then came the Jell-O salads. Oh, the Jell-O salads. Lime Jell-O with shredded carrots. Orange Jell-O with canned mandarin oranges. Lemon Jell-O with cottage cheese and pineapple. Each one was a gelatinous nightmare, a wobbly monument to mid-century culinary confusion. But they were also expected. Every proper housewife served Jell-O salad at dinner. Parties. It was colourful, it was festive, and it showed effort. You learned to make it perfectly. Dissolve the Jell-O in boiling water, add cold water, stir in the ingredients, pour into a mould, refrigerate overnight, unmould carefully onto a lettuce leaf, serve with a smile. Your guests will be impressed, Mrs. Henderson promised. You doubted that, but you didn't say anything. The recipes were rigid. No substitutions, no creativity. Follow the instructions exactly, or you'd fail. You learned to measure precisely, to time everything perfectly, to plate each dish with care. Cooking wasn't about flavour or joy or experimentation. It was about consistency, predictability, and meeting expectations. You also learned to cook on a schedule. Dinner had to be on the table at 6 o'clock sharp the moment your husband walked through the door. Not 5:59, not 6:01, 6. Which meant you had to plan backward. What time to start the roast, when to peel the potatoes, how long the vegetables would take. It was a logistical puzzle, and you were expected to solve it every single day for the rest of your life. Mrs. Henderson drilled this into you. A man works hard all day. The least you can do is have a hot meal waiting. The least you can do. As if cooking 3 meals a day, cleaning up after each one and planning the next day's menu was somehow easy. As if your labour didn't count. You practiced setting the table while dinner cooked. Fork on the left, knife and spoon on the right, plate in the centre, glass at the top right, napkin folded neatly. Everything had its place, and everything had to be perfect. Because dinner wasn't just about food. It was about performance. It was about showing your husband that you cared, that you were trying, that you were worthy. And if the meal failed, if the meatloaf was dry, if the potatoes were lumpy, if the Jell-O didn't set, it was your fault, not the recipe's fault, not the oven's fault, yours. You were supposed to anticipate problems, adjust on the fly, and deliver perfection every single time. By the end of the semester, you could make a week's worth of meals with your eyes closed. Meatloaf, Monday, tuna casserole Tuesday, pot roast Wednesday, fried chicken Thursday, spaghetti, Friday. Every meal was planned, predictable, and designed to please a man you hadn't even met yet. You'd absorbed the lesson. Your value was measured in your ability to feed, and if you couldn't cook, if you couldn't keep him satisfied, what good were you? Home economics didn't just teach you how to cook, it taught you how to manage a household budget. You learned to stretch a dollar, plan meals around sales, and never waste a scrap of food. You memorized the prices of staples like milk, bread, and eggs, and you practiced creating weekly meal plans that were nutritious, affordable, and husband-approved. Financial independence wasn't discussed. You were learning to be thrifty with someone else's paycheck because your job was to manage the home, not earn the money. Mrs. Henderson handed out worksheets, weekly meal planning on a budget. At the top, a number, $25. That was your grocery budget for the week. You had to feed a family of 4, husband, wife, 2 children, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. And you had to do it for $25. You stared at the blank spaces on the worksheet. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, multiply by 7. That was 21 meals, plus snacks, plus any baking or entertaining. $25 suddenly seemed impossible, but Mrs. Henderson was already explaining the strategy. Buy staples in bulk, shop the sales, use leftovers creatively, never waste anything. She wrote a sample grocery list on the board. Flour, sugar, eggs, milk, bread, butter, ground beef, chicken, canned vegetables, rice, pasta. The basics. Nothing fancy. Nothing fun. You practiced writing your own lists. Monday, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Tuesday, leftover meatloaf. Sandwiches for lunch, tuna casserole for dinner. Wednesday, pot roast, carrots, potatoes. Thursday, leftover pot roast stew. Friday, spaghetti. Saturday, fried chicken. Sunday, roast chicken, stuffing, vegetables. Every meal planned, every ingredient accounted for, every penny stretched. Mrs. Henderson taught you to memorize prices. Milk 25 cents a quart, bread 18 cents a loaf, ground beef 49 cents a pound, eggs 60 cents a dozen. You had to know these numbers by heart so you could calculate your total as you shopped. No surprises at the register, no going over budget. You also learned to shop strategically. Buy meat on sale and freeze it. Buy day-old bread at a discount. Grow your own vegetables if you had a yard. Can and preserve in the summer so you'd have food in the winter. Thriftiness wasn't just smart, it was virtuous. A good wife didn't waste money. A good wife made do. But here's what wasn't discussed. What if you wanted to work? What if you wanted your own income, your own budget, your own financial independence? Those questions were never asked. The assumption was clear. Your husband would provide and you would manage. His money, his decisions, your labour. You practiced balancing a checkbook. Deposits on one side, expenses on the other. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, clothing, medical bills. Everything had to add up. Everything had to be accounted for. And if there was anything left over, which there rarely was, it went into savings. Not for you, for the family, for emergencies, for the future. Mrs. Henderson was pragmatic. Money will always be tight, she warned. You'll need to be resourceful, creative, thrifty. Your husband is counting on you. And there it was again. Your worth measured in your ability to economize, to stretch, to sacrifice. You learned to make cheap meals seem special. Serve tuna casserole in a nice dish. Garnish meatloaf with parsley. Set the table with candles. It wasn't about the food, it was about the presentation, the effort, the care. You were supposed to make your husband feel valued, even when you were serving him the same leftovers for the 3rd time that week. And you learned to hide your own needs. If the budget was tight, you ate less. If there wasn't enough meat, you gave your portion to your husband and children. If you needed new shoes, you waited. Your needs were always last. Your comfort was always negotiable. Your sacrifice was expected. By the end of the unit, you could plan a week of meals on a shoestring budget. You could calculate grocery costs in your head. You could make $1 stretch further than seemed possible. You were prepared to be thrifty, resourceful, and self-sacrificing. But you'd also learned something darker, that your financial security depended entirely on someone else, that you had no claim to the money you managed, that your labour, the planning, the shopping, the cooking, the cleaning was unpaid, invisible, and expected, that you were an economic manager with no economy of your own, and that lesson, as much as any recipe or budget sheet, would shape the rest of your life. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was next to marriageability. You learned the proper way to mop a floor, dust furniture, polish silver, and clean windows until they sparkled. You were taught that a messy house was a reflection of a messy woman, and no man wanted to come home to chaos. So you practiced, scrubbing invisible dirt and perfecting your technique, preparing for a lifetime of unpaid domestic labour disguised as love. The cleaning unit began with a lecture. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the room, holding a feather duster like a sceptre. "A clean home is a happy home," she announced, "and a happy home is your responsibility." She explained the system, top to bottom, left to right. Always start at the highest point in the room and work your way down. Dust the ceiling corners first, then the shelves, then the furniture, then the baseboards. That way, the dirt falls downward and you clean it up as you go. It was logical, efficient, and utterly joyless. You practiced in the home ec model apartment, a fully furnished mock living room, kitchen, and bedroom set up for training purposes. It was eerie, like a dollhouse for humans. You moved through the rooms with your duster, your mop, your bucket of soapy water, cleaning surfaces that were already clean. First, dusting. You learned to use a damp cloth, not a dry one, so the dust stuck instead of just floating away. You wiped down every surface, shelves, picture frames, lamp bases, windowsills. You moved every object, dusted underneath it, and put it back exactly where it had been. Mrs. Henderson checked your work, running her finger along the edges of the shelves. If she found dust, you did it again. Next, vacuuming. You learned to vacuum in straight lines, overlapping each pass slightly to ensure complete coverage. You learned to move furniture, to vacuum underneath, to reach into corners with the hose attachment. The vacuum was heavy, loud, and awkward. Your arms ached, but you kept going, because a clean carpet was non-negotiable. Mopping came next. You filled a bucket with hot water and a capful of cleaner. You wrung out the mop until it was just damp, not soaking. You started in the far corner of the room and worked your way backward toward the door, so you didn't step on the clean floor. You moved in smooth, even strokes, covering every inch. And then you waited for it to dry before walking on it. You learned to clean bathrooms with military precision. Toilet first, scrub the bowl, wipe the seat, disinfect the handle, then the sink, scrub the basin, polish the faucet, wipe the mirror, then the tub, scrub the sides, rinse the soap scum, wipe the tiles. Everything had to shine. Everything had to smell like bleach and lemon, because a dirty bathroom was the ultimate housewifely failure. Windows were the final test. You learned to clean them with vinegar and newspaper, wiping in circular motions until there were no streaks, no smudges, no fingerprints. You worked on both sides, inside and out, until the glass was invisible. Mrs. Henderson inspected them from different angles, squinting in the light. Again, she'd say, pointing at a faint streak you couldn't even see. You also learned to polish silver, iron linens, and organise closets. Every task had a proper technique, a correct method, a standard of perfection, and you were expected to master them all. But here's what wasn't taught. Why this was your job. Why cleaning was women's work. Why your future husband wouldn't share this labour. Those questions were never asked, never answered. The assumption was baked in. Men worked outside the home, women worked inside it. And your work, exhausting, repetitive, invisible, didn't count as real work. Mrs. Henderson reminded you constantly. Your husband will notice if the house is dirty. He might not say anything, but he'll notice, and it will reflect on you. Your worth, once again, measured by the shine of your floors and the absence of dust. You practiced until your hands were raw, your back ached, and you could clean a room in your sleep. You absorbed the rhythm of it. Dust, vacuum, mop, polish, repeat. By the time you graduated, you were a domestic machine, programmed for perfection. But you'd also learn that cleanliness wasn't about hygiene or comfort. It was about control. It was about proving your value. It was about maintaining appearances, even when you were drowning in exhaustion. Because a clean house meant you were a good wife, and a good wife was all you were allowed to be. Etiquette wasn't optional, it was essential. You learned to sit with your knees together, never cross your legs at the knee, ankles only please, and always let a man open the door for you. You practiced walking with a book balanced on your head to perfect your posture. You memorized which fork to use at a formal dinner and how to write a proper thank you note. Every gesture, every word, every movement was carefully curated to project grace, modesty, and availability. You weren't just being polite, you were being packaged. The etiquette unit felt less like education and more like military training. Mrs. Henderson brought in a stack of heavy books, encyclopedias mostly, and demonstrated the proper walk. She placed one on her head, straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and glided across the room like she was floating. The book never wobbled. "Your turn," she said, and handed you a book. You balanced it carefully on your head, took one tentative step, and it tumbled to the floor with a thud. Laughter rippled through the classroom. You tried again, and again, and again, until you could walk the length of the room without dropping it. Your neck ached, your shoulders were rigid, but your posture was perfect, and that's what mattered. Sitting was another carefully choreographed performance. You learned to approach a chair from the side, smooth your skirt beneath you as you sat, and keep your knees pressed together at all times. Crossing your legs at the knee was vulgar. It showed too much leg, suggested too much freedom. Ankles only, demurely to the side, feet together. If your skirt rode up even an inch, you tugged it down immediately. Standing, you kept your weight evenly distributed, hands clasped in front of you, or resting lightly at your sides. Never in your pockets, that was slouchy, masculine, improper. Never crossed over your chest, that was defensive, unwelcoming. Every pose had a rule, and every rule reinforced the same message. Take up less space. Be decorative. Be pleasant to look at. Table manners were even more complex. You practiced with a full place setting. Multiple forks, multiple spoons, multiple knives, each with a specific purpose. Salad fork, dinner fork, dessert fork, soup spoon, teaspoon, dessert spoon. You memorized the rule, work from the outside, in. Start with the outermost utensils and move inward with each course. You learned to cut your food properly. Fork in the left hand, knife in the right, cut one bite at a time. Never saw at your meat like a lumberjack. Never shovel food into your mouth. Take small bites. Chew with your mouth closed. Dab your lips with your napkin. Don't wipe. And for heaven's sake, don't reach across the table. Ask someone to pass the salt and say please and thank you. Conversation at the table was its own minefield. You learned to make small talk, light, pleasant, non-controversial. Never discuss politics, religion, or money. Never dominate the conversation. Ask questions. Listen attentively. Laugh at jokes, even the bad ones. Make others feel comfortable, interesting, important. Your job wasn't to be interesting yourself. It was to make everyone else shine. You practiced writing thank you notes in perfect cursive on cream-coloured stationery. Dear Mrs. Peterson, thank you so much for the lovely dinner party. The roast was delicious, and the conversation was delightful. I do hope we can do it again soon. Sincerely, your name. Every note followed the same formula. Gratitude, compliment, closing. No personality, no spontaneity, just formula. You learned to answer the telephone properly. Hello, Smith residence, this is your name speaking. How may I help you? Never just hello or yeah. That was rude, uncultured, lower class. You were being trained to perform middle-class respectability, even if your family was barely scraping by. And then there were the rules about interactions with men. Always wait for him to open the door. Always let him pull out your chair. Always let him order for you at a restaurant. Thank him profusely for every small gesture, as if his basic courtesy was an extraordinary gift. Never walk ahead of him. Never interrupt him. Never correct him in public, even if he's wrong. You practiced all of this in role-play scenarios. One girl played the hostess, another the guest, one played the lady, another the gentleman. You move through the motions robotically, all grace and no feeling, all performance and no authenticity. You smiled until your face hurt. You spoke in soft, modulated tones until you forgot what your real voice sounded like. By the end of the unit, you could navigate a formal dinner party, conduct yourself properly in public, and present yourself as a lady. But you'd also learned something more insidious, that your natural way of being, loud, clumsy, opinionated, real, was wrong. That you needed to be refined, polished, controlled. That your body, your voice, your presence needed to be managed, curated, performed. You weren't learning manners, you were learning to disappear into a role, and the role was so tightly scripted, so rigidly defined, that there was no room left for you. Dating in the 50s wasn't about finding yourself, it was about finding a husband. And there were rules, strict ones. Never call a boy first. Never suggest where to go on a date. Never, ever appear too smart or too ambitious. Your job was to be pleasant, pretty and passive. Laugh at his jokes. Compliment his car. Let him feel like the man. And above all, protect your reputation, because one wrong move, staying out too late, kissing too soon, being seen with the wrong boy could ruin your chances forever. The rules were unwritten but universally understood. They circulated in whispered conversations at sleepovers, in magazine advice columns, in warnings from your mother delivered over the breakfast table. Boys don't like girls who are too forward. If you call him, he'll think you're desperate. Let him do the chasing. So you waited. You waited by the phone, hoping he'd call. You waited in the hallway at school, hoping he'd notice you. You waited at the soda fountain, hoping he'd ask you out. And if he did, if the phone finally rang, if he stammered through an invitation to the movies, you were supposed to act surprised, delighted, but not too eager. Oh, I'll have to check my calendar. You didn't have a calendar. You had nothing planned. But appearing too available was social suicide. On the date itself, you were expected to perform a careful balancing act. Be engaging, but not too talkative. Be attractive, but not too sexy. Be interested, but not too intense. Laugh at his jokes, even the ones that weren't funny. Compliment his car, his Letterman jacket, his choice of restaurant. Make him feel important, interesting, like the most fascinating person in the world. Conversation topics were carefully vetted. Ask him about his interests, sports, cars, school, his future plans. Listen attentively, nod, smile, make eye contact. But don't talk too much about yourself, especially not your own ambitions. If he asked what you wanted to do after graduation, you were supposed to give a vague, feminine answer. Oh, maybe teach for a little while, until I get married, of course. If you said you wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, his face would change. He'd smile politely, but the date would be over. Because boys didn't want to date girls who were smarter than them, more ambitious than them, more anything than them. They wanted girls who made them feel big. And you learned, quickly, to make yourself small. Physical boundaries were a minefield. You were supposed to be affectionate, but not too affectionate. A goodnight kiss was acceptable, maybe, on the third date. Anything more, and you were fast, easy, that kind of girl. But if you were too cold, too distant, he'd lose interest and move on to someone warmer. You had to thread the needle perfectly. Desirable, but untouchable. Flirtatious, but pure. And then there was the gossip. Oh, the gossip. If you went on a date and came home too late, the neighbours noticed. If you went parking with a boy, someone saw. If you kissed too many boys, even casually, you developed a reputation. And a reputation once earned was impossible to shake. You'd be whispered about in the hallways, excluded from parties, unmarriageable. Your mother warned you constantly. Boys will talk. They'll tell their friends everything. And once your reputation is ruined, no decent man will want you. So you policed your own behaviour obsessively. You watched the clock. You stayed in public places. You said no, even when you wanted to say yes. Because your future, your entire future, depended on staying good. There was also the pressure to go steady. If you'd been dating the same boy for a few weeks, he might offer you his class ring or his Letterman jacket. Going steady was a milestone, a sign that you were serious, that you were headed toward marriage. You wore his ring on a chain around your neck. You wore his jacket to school, and everyone knew you were taken. You were his. But going steady also meant giving up your freedom. You couldn't talk to other boys. You couldn't go out with friends if he wanted to see you. You were expected to be available, loyal, devoted. And if he wanted to break up, if he decided you weren't the one, you handed back the ring and tried not to cry in public. Because being dumped was humiliating, a social failure that marked you as unwanted. Meanwhile, boys faced none of these pressures. They could call or not call. They could date multiple girls. They could be ambitious, loud, confident. They could have fun without risking their futures. The double standard was suffocating, but no one talked about it. It was just the way things were. You learned to navigate the dating world like a tightrope walker, balancing impossible expectations with a forced smile. You learned to suppress your personality, your intelligence, your desires. You learned to perform the role of the perfect girlfriend. Pretty, pleasant, pliable, pure. And if you made one mistake, if you talked too much, laughed too loud, stayed out too late, kissed too passionately, you could lose everything. Not just the boy, not just the date, but your reputation, your future, your chance at the only goal that mattered, marriage. So you played the game, you followed the rules, you waited, smiled, and hoped that someday some boy would choose you. And when he did, you'd spend the rest of your life grateful that you'd been good enough, careful enough, invisible enough to be chosen. Your virginity wasn't just yours, it was a commodity, a bargaining chip, the ultimate prize you would give to your future husband on your wedding night. You were warned, lectured, and terrified into believing that losing it before marriage would make you worthless, damaged goods, unmarriageable. So you policed your body, your desires, and your boundaries, all while boys were quietly encouraged to sow their wild oats. The double standard was suffocating, but you didn't have the language to name it yet. The conversation happened behind closed doors, in hushed tones, usually with your mother or an aunt or the school nurse, never in a classroom, never openly. Sex education, if it existed at all, was vague, clinical, and terrifying. You learned about menstruation, becoming a woman, and you learned in no uncertain terms that your body was now dangerous. Boys will want things from you, your mother said, not looking at you directly. And it's your job to say no, not their job to respect your boundaries, your job to enforce them. Because boys, you were told, couldn't help themselves. They had urges, drives, biological imperatives. You, on the other hand, were supposed to be pure, controlled, the gatekeeper of morality. The metaphors were everywhere, and they were all degrading. You were a wrapped gift that would be worthless if opened early. You were a piece of tape that lost its stickiness after being used. You were a chewed piece of gum that no one would want. Each comparison stripped away your humanity and reduced you to an object whose only value lay in being unused. Church reinforced the message. Youth group leaders, usually well-meaning women, spoke in euphemisms about saving yourself and remaining pure. They talked about the wedding night as a sacred gift, a moment of ultimate intimacy reserved for marriage. They never mentioned pleasure, desire, or autonomy. They only mentioned consequence, pregnancy, shame, eternal damnation. Meanwhile, boys sat in a different room getting a different talk. They were warned about fast girls and told to be careful, but the underlying message was clear. Boys will be boys. Their sexuality was expected, even celebrated. Your sexuality didn't exist. Or if it did, it was something shameful, something to be suppressed, denied, locked away until a man unlocked it on your wedding night. The fear was constant. Every kiss, every touch, every moment alone with a boy felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. How far was too far? Where was the line? You'd been given no real information, just fear and shame and vague warnings. So you made up rules for yourself. Kissing was okay. Maybe. Touching over clothes was dangerous. Touching under clothes was absolutely forbidden. And sex, actual sex, was the ultimate sin. The unforgivable mistake that would ruin your life forever. You heard stories, whispered in bathroom stalls and locker rooms, about girls who'd gotten in trouble. Girls who disappeared for a few months, sent away to live with distant relatives. Girls who'd come back quiet, hollow, different. Girls whose names were spoken with pity and judgment. Did you hear about Susan? Such a shame. She was such a pretty girl. As if getting pregnant had erased her humanity, turned her into a cautionary tale. The threat of pregnancy loomed over everything. There was no birth control available to unmarried girls. Even married women struggled to access it. So pregnancy was the ultimate consequence, the visible proof of your sin. And if it happened, your options were limited and horrifying. Shotgun weddings, homes for unwed mothers, adoption, shame, silence. So you said no. You said no even when you wanted to say yes. You said no even when your body was screaming yes. You pushed away hands, you pulled down hemlines, you ended kisses before they went too far, and you felt guilty anyway, because even wanting it, even thinking about it felt dirty. And the boys? They pushed. They tested boundaries. They tried. Because they'd been told that girls were supposed to resist, that no sometimes meant try harder, that persistence was romantic. They'd seen it in movies. The man who wore down the woman's resistance until she finally gave in. So they pushed, and you pushed back, and every date became a battle over your body. You learned to blame yourself for their behaviour. If he tried to touch you, it was because you'd worn the wrong dress, sent the wrong signal, been too friendly. You learned to manage their desires, to keep them interested but not too interested, to walk the impossible line between desirable and pure, and all the while the clock was ticking. Because if you said no too many times, he'd lose interest and find a girl who was more fun. But if you said yes, even once, you were ruined. So you lived in a constant state of anxiety, policing your own body, your own desires, your own humanity. The irony was brutal. Your virginity was supposed to be your most valuable asset, but it also made you responsible for boys' behaviour. You were supposed to guard it, protect it, offer it only to your husband. But you were also supposed to be desirable, attractive, wanted. You were supposed to inspire lust while remaining pure. It was an impossible contradiction, and you were the one who would be punished if you failed. By the time you got engaged, you were so tangled up in shame and fear and misinformation that you could barely think about your wedding night without panicking. You'd spent your entire adolescence learning that sex was dangerous, dirty, sinful, and now you were supposed to suddenly flip a switch, to become passionate and willing and enjoy it. It was absurd, but that's what you'd been trained for. That's what the purity obsession had built. A generation of women who'd been taught that their bodies were commodities, their desires were shameful, and their worth depended entirely on staying good until some man decided they were worth marrying. Getting engaged wasn't just exciting, It was validation. It meant you'd done everything right. You'd been pretty enough, obedient enough, pleasant enough. You'd landed a man, and now you could finally relax, except you couldn't. Because now the real work began. Planning the wedding, preparing for marriage, and transforming from daughter to wife without losing your mind in the process. The moment he got down on one knee, everything changed. It didn't matter if you'd been dating for 6 months or 6 years. The ring on your finger transformed you instantly. You were no longer just a girl. You were a fiancé. And that came with a whole new set of expectations, pressures, and performances. Your mother cried. Your friends squealed. Your neighbours congratulated your parents. You must be so relieved, they said to your mother, as if you'd been a burden that had finally been lifted. And in a way, you had been. Because an unmarried daughter past a certain age was a worry, a problem, a conversation topic. But an engaged daughter, that was success. The ring itself became the centre of attention. Women grabbed your hand to inspect it, holding it up to the light, evaluating the size of the diamond, the quality of the setting. Oh, how lovely they'd coo, but you could see them calculating, comparing it to their own rings or their daughter's rings. The diamond wasn't just a symbol of love, it was a measure of your value, proof that your fiancé could provide. Suddenly you were thrust into a whirlwind of wedding planning. Your mother took control immediately, as if the wedding were hers and not yours. Guest lists, venues, flowers, music, food, every decision required her approval. This is the most important day of your life, she reminded you constantly. We need to get it right. But the planning was exhausting. You met with florists, caterers, dressmakers, musicians. You debated colour schemes, seating arrangements, menu options. Every choice felt monumental, as if the success of your entire marriage hinged on whether you chose roses or carnations. And the cost, even a modest wedding, was expensive. You watched your father's face tighten every time another invoice arrived. Meanwhile, everyone had advice. Your aunts told you what kind of dress to wear. Your grandmother insisted on certain traditions. Your future mother-in-law had opinions about everything, and if you disagreed, you risked starting the marriage off on the wrong foot. You were supposed to be grateful, accommodating, flexible. It was your wedding, but somehow it wasn't about you at all. Your fiancé, for his part, was largely absent from the planning. He showed up for the big decisions, the venue, the date, but the rest was woman's work. He went to work, played golf, hung out with his friends. You planned, stressed, and coordinated, all while maintaining your job, your household duties, and your appearance. Because even engaged, you couldn't let yourself go. And then there were the showers. Bridal showers, kitchen showers, linen showers, events where women gathered to give you the tools you'd need to set up a home. You unwrapped toasters, blenders, dish sets, towels, sheets. Each gift came with advice, sometimes helpful, often patronizing. You'll need this when you're making his breakfast. This will make cleaning so much easier. A good wife always has nice linens. You smiled, took notes, wrote thank you cards in your perfect cursive. But the pressure was building, because the wedding wasn't just a party, it was a test. A test of your organisational skills, your taste, your ability to bring people together. If the wedding was beautiful, you were capable. If it was a disaster, you were incompetent. No pressure. Beneath all the excitement, there was anxiety. You were about to leave your family, your home, your childhood. You were about to become someone's wife. A role you'd been preparing for your entire life but still didn't fully understand. What if you weren't good enough? What if you failed? What if marriage wasn't what you'd been promised? But you couldn't voice these doubts. Not to your mother, who'd tell you it was just cold feet. Not to your friends, who'd think you were ungrateful. Not even to yourself, really, because admitting fear felt like admitting failure. So you pushed it down, smiled for the engagement photos, and kept planning. The wedding date loomed closer. Your dress hung in your closet, a white symbol of purity and promise. Your hope chest was full. Your thank you notes were written. Your future was decided, and you were supposed to be happy, ecstatic, grateful. But late at night, alone in your childhood bedroom, you sometimes wondered, is this it? Is this what I've been working toward my entire life? A dress, a ring, a party, and then what? You didn't have answers. You just had a date on the calendar and a long list of things to do before you walked down the aisle. So you kept moving forward because that's what you'd been taught to do. Keep smiling, keep planning, keep performing. The ultimate achievement was within reach. All you had to do was not mess it up. Before you even got married, you started collecting towels, dishes, silverware, linens. Your hope chest, a wooden trunk filled with household goods, was your domestic dowry, proof that you were ready to set up a home. Bridal showers weren't just parties. They were ceremonies where older women passed down advice and judgment, while you unwrapped toasters and cake pans. You smiled, took notes, and quietly panicked. The hope chest sat at the foot of your bed, a large cedar trunk that smelled faintly of mothballs and promise. You'd started filling it when you were 15, collecting items for a future you could barely imagine. Dish towels embroidered with flowers, matching pillowcases, a set of everyday dishes, a good set of silverware, each item carefully chosen, carefully stored, carefully preserved for the day you'd finally need them. Your mother added to it too. A tablecloth that had been hers, a cast-iron skillet, a set of mixing bowls. You'll need these, she'd say, folding them into the chest like she was packing supplies for a long journey. Which in a way she was. Marriage was a journey, and you needed to be prepared. When your engagement was announced, the showers began. Your aunt hosted the first one, a luncheon in her living room with 15 women crowded onto sofas and folding chairs. They were all older, mothers, aunts, family friends, and they watched you with a mixture of nostalgia and assessment. You were being inducted into their club, and they were here to make sure you were ready. The gifts were practical, aggressively so. A potato masher, a set of wooden spoons, a flour sifter, dish towels, oven mitts, measuring cups. Each one came with a story. "I've had mine for 20 years, one woman said, handing you a rolling pin. "A good rolling pin will last you a lifetime." You thanked her, tried to look excited about a rolling pin, and added it to the growing pile. Between gifts, the advice flowed freely. Never go to bed angry. Always have dinner ready when he gets home. Keep yourself pretty. Men's eyes wander. The advice was delivered as wisdom, passed down from generation to generation, but it all had the same undertone: sacrifice, accommodate, serve. Your job was to make him happy, and if you did that, everything else would fall into place. Some of the advice was more personal, delivered in whispers during trips to the bathroom or while cutting cake in the kitchen. On your wedding night, just let him do what he needs to do. It gets easier. You nodded, mortified, not sure what she meant, but too embarrassed to ask. Sex was still shrouded in euphemism and silence, even here, even now. The kitchen shower was next, hosted by your future mother-in-law. This one was even more pointed. She wanted to make sure you could properly care for her son. You unwrapped casserole dishes, baking pans, a new set of pots. "My son loves my pot roast," she said meaningfully. "I'll give you the recipe." It wasn't a gift, it was a test. Could you replicate her cooking? Could you fill her shoes? Your friends threw a younger, slightly more fun shower. There was champagne, giggles, and gifts that were a little less practical. Lingerie, perfume, a silk robe. But even this shower carried weight. The lingerie was supposed to excite your husband, the perfume was supposed to keep you feminine, and the robe was supposed to make you look elegant while serving him breakfast. Everything, always, circled back to him. You kept a list of who gave you what, writing each gift meticulously in a notebook so you could send proper thank you notes. The notes had to be handwritten, personal and prompt. Dear Mrs. Williams, thank you so much for the beautiful mixing bowls. I know I'll use them often as I start my new life. Your generosity means the world to me. And through it all, your hope chest filled up. By the time your wedding day arrived, it was packed. You had everything you needed to set up a home. Linens, cookware, cleaning supplies, decorative items. It was a domestic dowry, proof that you were prepared, that you'd been trained, that you were ready to be a wife. But there was something strange about it, something that made you uneasy even if you couldn't articulate why. All of these items, these towels and dishes and pots, they represented your future, but they also represented labour, unpaid labour, invisible labour. The hope chest was full of tools for work you'd be doing for the rest of your life. Work that wouldn't be called work that would be called love. You looked at the chest sometimes late at night and wondered, is this all there is? A trunk full of things to help me cook, clean and serve? Is this what my whole life has been building toward? But you didn't voice those thoughts. You smiled at the showers, you wrote the thank you notes, you packed the trunk. Because this was what you were supposed to want. This was the dream. And if it didn't feel quite right, if it felt more like a cage than a gift, well, you just needed to adjust your expectations. After all, every woman before you had done this. Your mother, your grandmother, your aunts. They'd all packed their hope chests, attended their showers, and walked into marriage with a smile. And if they could do it, so could you. So you closed the lid of the trunk, turned the key in the lock, and waited for your wedding day. The chest was ready. You just had to be ready too. Your wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was the culmination of everything you'd been preparing for since birth. The dress, the flowers, the cake, the guest list, every detail mattered. But the pressure was enormous. This one day was supposed to define your worth, your happiness, your future. And once it was over, you'd be someone's wife, and the real performance would begin. The wedding planning consumed everything. From the moment your engagement was announced, your life became a checklist. Venue, date, guest list, flowers, music, food, dress, invitations, photographer. Every item required research, decisions, money, and stress. Your mother took charge, which was both a relief and a source of tension. She had opinions about everything, and since your father was paying, her opinions carried weight. We can't invite fewer than 200 people, she insisted. What will people think? Never mind that you barely knew half the guest list. This wasn't about you. It was about family, appearances, social obligations. The venue was chosen based on capacity and respectability. The church, of course, for the ceremony. The church hall or a local hotel for the reception. Anything too unconventional would raise eyebrows. You want a traditional wedding, your mother said firmly. Trust me, the dress was a whole ordeal unto itself. You visited bridal shops with your mother, your bridesmaids, your future mother-in-law. You tried on dozens of white gowns, lace, satin, tulle, each one heavy, uncomfortable and expensive. You stood on a platform while women circled you, pinning, adjusting, critiquing. This one makes you look too pale. That one is too modern. This neckline is too low. Every dress was evaluated not on how you felt in it, but on how it looked to others. Would it photograph well? Would it be appropriate? Would it make you look like a proper bride? When you finally chose one, a traditional white gown with a fitted bodice and a full skirt, the seamstress took your measurements and scheduled multiple fittings. The dress had to be perfect. You'd wear it for a few hours, but it would be in photographs forever. No pressure. The guest list was a political minefield. Your parents wanted to invite distant relatives, business associates, neighbours they barely spoke to. Your fiancé's parents had their own list of must-invites. You wanted to invite your close friends, but there wasn't room for everyone. Every addition to the list meant more money, more food, more chairs, more tension. Invitations had to be ordered months in advance. The wording was formal, traditional. Mr. and Mrs., your father's name, request the honour of your presence at the marriage of their daughter. Your name appeared only as their daughter. You weren't the host of your own wedding. You were the occasion. Flowers, cake, music. Every decision required consultations, contracts, deposits. The florist suggested roses, lilies, baby's breath. The baker showed you tiers and frosting styles. The band or DJ needed a list of acceptable songs. Nothing too fast, your mother warned. We want it elegant. And the cost was staggering. Your father's face grew tighter with every bill. Your mother justified each expense. This is her day. We only do this once. But you felt the weight of it, the expectation that this one day, this single day, had to be perfect, memorable, worth every penny. Meanwhile, your fiancé was largely uninvolved. He showed up for the major decisions, nodded, agreed, then went back to work. "Whatever you want, honey," he'd say, which sounded supportive but felt dismissive. This was your job, your responsibility, your performance. The pressure built as the date approached. You worried about the weather, about the dress fitting properly, about guests RSVPing, about something going wrong, a late vendor, a drunken uncle, a smudged lipstick. You had nightmares about walking down the aisle and tripping, or getting to the reception and finding no food. Everyone kept reminding you, this is the most important day of your life. Your mother said it, your aunt said it, bridal. Magazines screamed it from every cover, and the weight of it was crushing. Because if this was the most important day, what did that say about all the days after? Did your life peak at the wedding and then just plateau into housework and child rearing? But you couldn't think about that. Not now. Now you had seating charts to finalise and place cards to write in your perfect cursive. You had a rehearsal to attend, a rehearsal dinner to smile through. You had a wedding to execute flawlessly. And on the morning of the wedding, as you sat in your childhood bedroom for the last time, white dress hanging on the door, makeup half finished, hair in rollers, you felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Excitement because this was what you'd been taught to want your whole life. Dread because once you walked down that aisle, your life would no longer be yours. You'd be a wife. And being a wife came with expectations you were only beginning to understand. But there was no turning back. The guests were arriving, the flowers were arranged, the cake was frosted, the show was about to begin. And you were the star, ready or not. The honeymoon was supposed to be romantic, magical, the start of your happily ever after. But no one really prepared you for the wedding night. Sex education was non-existent or vague at best. You were expected to be innocent, ignorant, and somehow instinctively good at it. The pressure to please, to perform, to not disappoint was immense. And if it hurt, if it was awkward, if you felt confused, well, that was just part of being a wife. The honeymoon began immediately after the reception. You changed out of your wedding dress into a going-away outfit, a smart suit, heels, gloves, hat. You waved goodbye to your parents, your friends, your childhood. Your new husband helped you into the car, and you drove away toward what? Exactly. If you were lucky, it was a week at a resort or a cabin. If money was tight, maybe just a weekend at a motel, a few. Towns over. Either way, the destination wasn't really the point. The point was the wedding night. The thing everyone had been hinting at, euphemizing, warning you about for years. Your mother had pulled you aside the day before the wedding for the talk. She was uncomfortable. You were mortified. And the conversation was so vague it was almost useless. "Just let him do what he needs to do," she'd whispered. "It might hurt the first time, but it gets better. and it's your wifely duty. Duty. That word hung heavy. Not pleasure, not intimacy, not mutual desire. Duty. Something you owed, something required, something to be endured. Your friends had whispered their own stories at the bachelorette party. Slightly more helpful, but still shrouded in giggles and embarrassment. It's not that bad. Make sure you have some Vaseline. Just close your eyes and think about something else. Not exactly inspiring. So you arrived at the hotel room on your wedding night with a strange mix of curiosity, fear, and resignation. Your husband was nervous too, though he tried to hide it. He fumbled with the key, opened the door, carried you over the threshold because tradition demanded it, and then you were alone, together, married, expected to consummate. You excused yourself to the bathroom to change into the white lacy nightgown from your trousseau. It was supposed to be alluring, but you felt ridiculous, exposed, vulnerable. You brushed your teeth, stared at yourself in the mirror, and tried to calm your racing heart. When you came out, he was sitting on the edge of the bed in his undershirt and boxers. The mood was less romantic and more awkward. There was no script for this, no home ec class that taught you how to navigate this moment. You'd been taught to say no your entire life, and now you were supposed to say yes. The switch was jarring. What happened next varied wildly depending on the individuals involved. For some, it was tender, fumbling, a mutual attempt at connection. For others, it was painful, confusing, disappointing. You'd been told it would hurt, so when it did, you stayed silent, biting your lip, trying not to cry because you didn't want to ruin his experience. Pleasure wasn't discussed. Your pleasure wasn't even a consideration. The wedding night was about consummation, about his needs, about officially becoming his wife in every sense. If you felt nothing, if you were left confused and vaguely traumatized, that was normal. That was just how it was for women. Afterward, you lay in the dark wondering if that was it, if that was what all the whispers and warnings had been about. It seemed underwhelming, uncomfortable, clinical. You'd expected magic, romance, fireworks. Instead, you got awkwardness, pain, and the lingering feeling that something was wrong with you for not enjoying it. But you couldn't say that. Not to your friends, not to your mother, and certainly not to your husband. So you smiled the next morning, thanked him for a lovely evening, and tried to act like a woman who knew what she was doing. The rest of the honeymoon was supposed to be blissful, romantic dinners, sightseeing, long walks. But the nights were the same: duty, performance, pretending. You learned quickly to fake enjoyment because his ego required it. If he thought you weren't satisfied, he might think he was failing, and you'd been trained your whole life to make men feel successful. You also learned that sex wasn't just a wedding night event, it was an ongoing expectation. Your body was no longer entirely yours. It was his to access, his to expect, his to use. And refusing him, you'd been warned, was grounds for unhappiness, resentment, even infidelity. Never say no to your husband, your mother had whispered. That's how you lose him. So you said yes, even when you were tired, even when you weren't interested, even when you just wanted to sleep, because that was part of the bargain you'd made when you said I do. You were a wife now, and wives had duties. The honeymoon ended and you returned home, not to your childhood home, but to your new home, the one you'd share with your husband. You unpacked your hope chest, arranged your wedding gifts, and began your new life. The life you'd been trained for. The life that started with a painful, awkward, disappointing wedding night and stretched out before you in an endless series of meals to cook, floors to clean, and duties to perform. And if you felt lost, confused, or quietly disappointed, you kept it to yourself. Because this was the dream. This was what you'd wanted, what you'd worked for, what you'd been promised. And if it didn't feel like a dream, well, maybe you just weren't trying hard enough. Once married, your transformation was complete. You moved to the suburbs, into a tidy little house with a white picket fence. You wore a dress and heels even to vacuum. Your days followed a strict routine: breakfast, cleaning, laundry, grocery shopping, dinner prep, all timed, perfectly around your husband's work schedule. You were a manager, a maid, a cook, and a hostess, all unpaid, all expected, all invisible. Your new home was in a development where every house looked almost identical: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen, a living room, and a patch of lawn. It was modest, affordable, and exactly like your neighbours' homes. You were supposed to feel grateful. Your husband had provided. You had shelter, appliances, a place to build your life. This was the American dream. Your uniform was established immediately. Even though you never left the house most days, you were expected to look presentable. Hair curled and set, makeup applied, a house dress, modest, practical, but still feminine, and an apron tied around your waist, and heels, always heels, even while mopping the floor. You never know who might stop by, your mother had warned, and your husband deserves to come home to a wife who looks nice, so you dressed up to do housework, which was exhausting and absurd, but also mandatory. Letting yourself go was the first step toward losing your husband's interest, or so everyone said. Your day began at 6 a.m. before your husband woke. You needed to be showered, dressed, and presentable before he saw you. No curlers, no cold cream, no glimpse of the backstage preparation. By the time he came downstairs, breakfast was ready. Eggs, toast, bacon, coffee. He ate, read the paper, kissed you on the cheek, and left for work. And then the real work began. You cleared the breakfast dishes, washed them, dried them, put them away. You made the bed with hospital corners. You swept the floors. You started the laundry, feeding sheets and towels through the wringer washer, hanging them on the line outside to dry. Monday was laundry day. Tuesday was ironing. Wednesday was floors. Thursday was bathrooms. Friday was shopping. Saturday was baking and meal prep. Sunday was church and family dinners. The schedule was rigid, passed down like sacred text. Deviation meant inefficiency, and inefficiency meant failure. Grocery shopping was a military operation. You planned the week's meals in advance, made a list organised by store aisle, and stuck to your budget down to the penny. You compared prices, clipped coupons, and never bought anything impulsive or frivolous. At the checkout, you smiled politely at the grocer, who loaded your paper bags and sometimes carried them to the car if you were lucky. Back home, you put away the groceries, started dinner prep, and checked the clock. Dinner had to be ready by 6, the moment your husband walked through the door. Not 5:59, not 6:01, 6. You timed everything backward. If the roast needed an hour, you started it at 5. If the potatoes needed 30 minutes, you peeled them at 5:30. It was a choreographed dance, and you performed it alone. At 6, the door opened. "Honey, I'm home." Your husband hung up his coat, loosened his tie, and sank into his armchair with the evening paper. You brought him a drink, a whiskey, a beer, whatever he preferred, and returned to the kitchen to finish dinner. You set the table, you served the food, you sat down with him, but you didn't really eat. You were too busy watching to make sure he had enough, that everything tasted right, that he was satisfied. If he complimented the meal, you glowed. If he said nothing, you worried you'd done something wrong. After dinner, he retired to the living room to watch television. You cleared the dishes, washed them, cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters, swept the floor. By the time you finished, it was 8:30 or 9. You joined him on the sofa, but he was already half asleep. You watched TV in silence, or did mending, or planned tomorrow's meals. At 10, you both went to bed. If he wanted sex, you obliged. If not, you fell asleep immediately, exhausted from a day of invisible labour. And then the alarm rang at 6 a.m. and it started all over. Again. Breakfast, cleaning, laundry, shopping, dinner. Every day the same routine, the same invisible work, the same performance of the perfect housewife. Your uniform was always clean. Your home was always spotless. Your husband was always fed. And you were always exhausted, always performing, always invisible. Because the goal wasn't to be seen, it was to make everything look effortless, to make it seem like the house cleaned itself, the food cooked itself, the laundry folded itself. To disappear into the role so completely that no one even noticed you were there. And some days, you barely noticed either. The kitchen wasn't just a room. It was your kingdom, your battlefield, your stage. You spent hours there every day, preparing 3 meals from scratch, baking, canning, preserving. Your worth was measured in the quality of your pot roast and the fluffiness of your biscuits. A burned dinner wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure. And failures weren't tolerated. The kitchen was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, but it was yours. The walls were painted cheerful yellow. The countertops were formica. The cabinets held your wedding dishes, your mixing bowls, your carefully organised spices. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. The stove, a white enamel beauty with 4 burners and an oven, stood ready. This was where you spent most of your waking hours. Cooking, yes, but also planning, organising, managing. The kitchen wasn't just where food was made, it was the command centre of the entire household. From here, you controlled the family's nutrition, health, schedule, and happiness. No pressure. Breakfast was first. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. Fresh squeezed orange juice if you had time. You cooked everything from scratch. No boxes, no shortcuts. Even the bread was homemade, baked twice a week in large loaves that filled the house with the smell of yeast and warmth. Lunch depended on the day. If your husband came home, some did, you prepared a hot meal. Soup, sandwiches, leftovers heated and presented nicely. If he ate at work, you had a lighter lunch alone. A salad, maybe, a cup of tea. You never lingered over it, though. There was always something to do. Dinner was the main event, the performance that defined your day. You'd been planning it since yesterday, shopping for it this morning, prepping for it all afternoon. The pressure was immense because dinner wasn't just food, it was proof. Proof that you were a good wife, a competent cook, a woman worth keeping. You followed recipes religiously. Betty Crocker, Better Homes and Gardens, your mother's handwritten cards. You didn't improvise, that was dangerous. What if it didn't turn out? What if he didn't like it? Better to stick with what worked, what was safe, what was proven. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, meatloaf with green beans, fried chicken with mashed potatoes, spaghetti with garlic bread, tuna casserole, beef stew, pork chops. The menu rotated on a weekly basis, predictable and comforting. He knew what to expect and you knew you could deliver. But cooking was only half the job. You also had to time everything perfectly. The meat had to be tender but not dry. The vegetables had to be cooked but not mushy. The bread had to be warm. Everything had to hit the table at exactly the same moment at exactly 6 o'clock. And if something went wrong, if the roast was tough, if the potatoes were lumpy, if you forgot to salt the vegetables, you could see it in his face. Disappointment, frustration, silence. And that silence was worse than any complaint because it meant you'd failed. You learned to read his moods through food. If he had seconds, you'd succeeded. If he complimented the meal, you'd excelled. If he ate quietly and then retreated to the living room, you disappointed him. And disappointing him felt like the end of the world because your entire identity was wrapped up in being a good wife. And being a good wife meant being a good cook. The kitchen was also where you did the invisible work that no one saw. Meal planning, inventory management, budgeting. You tracked what was in the pantry, what needed to be used before it spoiled, what was on sale at the grocery store. You calculated costs in your head, stretching every dollar as far as it would go. You baked bread, cakes, cookies, pies. You made jam from fruit you'd picked yourself. You canned vegetables in the summer so you'd have them in the winter. You pickled cucumbers, preserved peaches, bottled tomatoes. Your pantry was a testament to your industry. Rows of glass jars lined up like soldiers. But it was exhausting. Your feet ached from standing all day. Your hands were raw from washing dishes, scrubbing pots, kneading dough. Your back hurt from bending over the oven, the sink, the countertop. And you were always cooking. Because as soon as one meal was done, it was time to start planning the next. And the worst part? No one noticed unless you failed. If dinner was perfect, it was expected. If dinner was late or burned or bland, it was a catastrophe. Your successes were invisible, but your failures were magnified. It was an impossible standard, and you held yourself to it every single day. The kitchen was your kingdom, yes, but it was also your prison. Beautiful, functional, and suffocating. Hosting dinner parties was a test of your skills as a wife. You cleaned the house, set the table with your best china, cooked a multi-course meal, and made it all look effortless. Your husband's colleagues and their wives came to judge your home, your food, your hospitality. You smiled, served, and stayed silent during the men's conversations, all while mentally calculating whether you'd added enough salt to the roast. The dinner party was announced a week in advance. "We should have the Hendersons over," your husband said casually over breakfast. You smiled and nodded, but inside the panic began. A week wasn't much time to prepare for what was essentially a performance review. Because dinner parties weren't social events, they were evaluations. The guests would judge everything: the cleanliness of your home, the quality of your food, the elegance of your table setting, your appearance, your demeanour, and their judgment would reflect on your husband. If you impressed them, he looked good. If you failed, he was embarrassed. The stakes were enormous. You spent the week planning obsessively. The menu had to be impressive but not too fancy, delicious but not too exotic. You decided on a safe, elegant spread: roast chicken with herb stuffing, scalloped potatoes, green beans almondine, fresh rolls, and a cherry pie for dessert. Classic, crowd-pleasing, foolproof. You shopped carefully, selecting the best cuts of meat, the freshest vegetables, the ripest cherries. You bought fresh flowers for the table. You polished the silver until it gleamed. You washed the good china, the set you'd received as a wedding gift and only used for special occasions. The day of the party, you woke early and began cleaning. The house had to be immaculate. You vacuumed, dusted, scrubbed, polished. You cleaned rooms that the guests would never enter just in case. You scrubbed the bathroom until it sparkled. You fluffed the sofa cushions. You hid any clutter, any sign of real life, any evidence that people actually lived here. By mid-afternoon, you started cooking. The chicken went in the oven first, roasting slowly while you prepared the side dishes. You peeled and sliced potatoes, layering them with cream and cheese. You blanched the green beans and toasted the almonds. You kneaded dough for the rolls, shaped them, and left them to rise. All the while, you checked the clock obsessively. The guests would arrive at 7. The meal needed to be ready by 7:30. Everything had to be timed perfectly, plated beautifully, served hot. At 5, you stopped cooking and went to get ready. You showered, set your hair, applied makeup, put on your best dress, modest but elegant, feminine but not flashy. You slipped on heels, added a string of pearls, and checked yourself in the mirror. You needed to look fresh, put together, effortlessly elegant, as if you hadn't just spent 8 hours cleaning and cooking. At 6:30, your husband came home, showered, changed, and poured himself a drink. By 6:55, you were both in the living room waiting. The house smelled amazing. The table was set beautifully. Everything was ready. You took a deep breath and prayed nothing would go wrong. The Hendersons arrived promptly at 7. You greeted them warmly, took their coats, offered drinks. You made small talk while your husband chatted with Mr. Henderson about work, sports, politics. You smiled, nodded, laughed at the appropriate moments. You were charming but not too talkative, engaging but not dominating. When it was time for dinner, you excused yourself to the kitchen and began plating. You arranged everything beautifully. The chicken sliced and fanned, the potatoes golden and bubbling, the green beans bright and glossy. You carried the plates out one by one, serving the guests first, your husband next, yourself last. The conversation flowed around you. Work gossip, local news, sports scores. The men dominated the discussion. You and Mrs. Henderson smiled, nodded, occasionally contributed a light comment. Mostly you listened, served, and monitored the meal anxiously. Was the chicken moist enough? Were the potatoes too salty? Did they like the beans? Mr. Henderson complimented the food. Delicious, absolutely delicious. Relief flooded through you. Your husband smiled, proud. You'd passed the test. After dinner, you cleared the plates, served the pie and coffee, and then quietly retreated to the kitchen to clean. You washed dishes, wiped counters, put away leftovers, all while the guests laughed and chatted in the other room. Your work was invisible but essential. The performance continued, even after the meal ended. By the time the Hendersons left, it was nearly 11. You said goodbye, closed the door, and collapsed onto the sofa. Your feet ached. Your face hurt from smiling. You were exhausted. But your husband kissed your forehead and said, "Great job tonight." Henderson was impressed. And that was it. That was your reward, approval, validation, the knowledge that you'd performed well, that you'd made him look good, that you'd succeeded in your role. You went to bed that night too tired to think, knowing that in the morning the routine would start again, and in a few months you'd host another dinner party, perform another test, seek another moment of approval. Because this was your life now. A series of performances, each one judged, each one exhausting, each one invisible except when you failed. Children were expected, non-negotiable. You were supposed to want them, love them, and raise them perfectly, all while maintaining a spotless home and a cheerful demeanour. Postpartum depression? Never heard of it. Exhaustion. Suck it up. You were a mother now, and motherhood was supposed to be fulfilling, even when you were drowning. The question wasn't if you'd have children, it was when. From the moment you returned from your honeymoon, people started asking, "Any news yet?" Your mother-in-law smiled expectantly every time she visited. Your neighbours raised their eyebrows. Even strangers at the grocery store felt entitled to comment on your empty arms. If you'd been married for 6 months without getting pregnant, the whispers started. Maybe she has a problem. Maybe he has a problem. Maybe they're being selfish. The pressure was suffocating. Having children wasn't a choice. It was your biological destiny, your purpose, the reason you existed as a woman. When you finally got pregnant, because you would, eventually, whether you felt ready or not, everyone celebrated. Your husband beamed. Your mother cried happy tears. Your neighbours congratulated you. You were supposed to be glowing, radiant, overcome with joy. And maybe you were, for a moment. But beneath the joy was terror, because you had no idea what you were doing. Pregnancy in the 50s was medicalised and paternalistic. Your doctor, always male, told you what to eat, how much weight to gain, what activities to avoid. He didn't ask how you felt. He told you how you should feel. Perfectly natural, he'd say, dismissing your nausea, your exhaustion, your anxiety. All women go through this. You attended prenatal appointments alone. Your husband wasn't expected to come. Childbirth was women's work. and his presence would be awkward. So you sat in waiting rooms with other pregnant women, all of you silent, all of you preparing for something you didn't fully understand. Labour began at home, contractions, pain, the slow realisation that this was happening whether you were ready or not. Your husband drove you to the hospital, kissed your forehead and left you at the door. He wasn't allowed in the delivery room. That would be unseemly. Instead, he waited in a special room with other expectant fathers, smoking cigarettes and pacing. In the delivery room, you were alone with nurses and a doctor you barely knew. They shaved you, gave you an enema and strapped you to the bed. If you cried out, they told you to be quiet. If you asked for pain relief, they might give you something, or they might tell you to toughen up. Women have been doing this for thousands of years. When the baby finally came, screaming, bloody, perfect, they whisked it away before you could even see if it was a boy or a girl. You were stitched up, cleaned up, and wheeled to a recovery room. Hours later, a nurse brought you your baby, wrapped tightly in a hospital blanket. "It's a girl," she said, placing her in your arms. You stared at this tiny stranger and felt what? Love? Yes, but also terror. This was your responsibility now. Forever. No instruction manual, no practice run. Just you, this baby, and the expectation that you'd know exactly what to do. At home, the reality set in. The baby cried constantly. You had no idea why. Hungry, wet, tired, sick. You tried everything, feeding, changing, rocking, singing. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. You were exhausted, running on 2 hours of sleep, your body still healing from childbirth, your emotions a tangled mess. But there was no sympathy. Babies cry, people said with a shrug. You'll get used to it. Your mother visited and offered advice that contradicted the doctor's advice that contradicted the baby book's advice. Everyone had an opinion. No one had answers. Your husband came home from work, kissed the baby and retreated to his armchair. Rough day, he'd say, as if your day, spent covered in spit up, rocking a screaming infant, trying to clean the house one-handed, had been a vacation. He helped occasionally, holding the baby while you made dinner, but child-rearing was your domain, your responsibility, your job, and postpartum depression? That wasn't a diagnosis yet. If you cried uncontrollably, if you felt detached from your baby, if you fantasized about running away, you were told you were being dramatic, hormonal, ungrateful, you have a healthy baby. What more could you want? So you pushed through. You smiled when people visited. You pretended everything was wonderful. You posed for photos with your baby, looking serene and maternal, while inside you were screaming. Because motherhood was supposed to be instinctive, natural, fulfilling. And if it wasn't, if you were struggling, if you were miserable, if you regretted it even for a second, that meant something was wrong with you. Not with the system, not with the impossible expectations, with you. Even after marriage, you couldn't let yourself go. Your hair had to be styled, your makeup fresh, your dress pressed. You were competing with every other housewife on the block, and your husband's wandering eye was always a threat. So you dieted, you exercised, you maintained, all while pretending it was effortless. The warning came early, whispered by older women at bridal showers. Don't let yourself go after the wedding. It was framed as advice, but it was really a threat. Let yourself go, and you'd lose him. Let yourself go, and he'd find someone younger, prettier, more attentive. Let yourself go, and it would be your fault when he strayed. So even though you were exhausted from housework, childcare, and the endless demands of being a wife, you still had to look good, every single day, no exceptions, no days off. Your appearance wasn't about you, it was about keeping him interested, keeping him satisfied, keeping him yours. Your morning routine started before he woke. You rolled out of bed, crept to the bathroom and began the transformation. Cold cream to clean your face, moisturizer, foundation, powder, lipstick, mascara, blush. You set your hair in rollers the night before and now you brushed it out into perfect waves. You checked yourself in the mirror, making sure you looked fresh, pretty, put together. By the time he came downstairs for breakfast, you were already done. He never saw you with a bare face, messy hair, or wrinkled pajamas. That version of you was too real, too human. He needed the performance, the illusion that you woke up looking this way naturally. After he left for work, you might have relaxed for a moment, except you couldn't. The neighbours might stop by. The mailman might see you. And besides, you'd been trained to maintain standards even when no one was watching. Letting yourself be sloppy, even alone, felt like failure. Your wardrobe was carefully maintained. You wore dresses or skirts every day. Pants were too masculine, too casual. You rotated through a small collection. House dresses for daily wear, nicer dresses for shopping or appointments, your best dresses for church or entertaining. Each one was ironed, hemmed properly, accessorized with a belt or scarf. Your weight was monitored obsessively. You weighed yourself every morning, and if the number crept up even a pound, you panicked. Magazines screamed at you, lose 10 pounds before summer, the grapefruit diet that works, how to keep your figure after baby. Every advertisement showed impossibly thin women with tiny waists, and you were supposed to look like them. So you dieted. You skipped breakfast, ate tiny lunches, and gave your husband the larger portions at dinner. You drank black coffee to suppress your appetite. You tried every fad diet, grapefruit and boiled eggs, cottage cheese and canned peaches, cabbage soup, until you couldn't stand the smell. You were always hungry, always tired, always irritable, but you were also always trying. Exercise wasn't a hobby, it was homework. You did calisthenics in the living room, following along with a television program. Leg lifts, sit-ups, stretches. You walked around the block, pushing a stroller, calling it exercise even though you were just running. Errands. You wore a girdle to cinch your waist, creating the illusion of the hourglass figure you were supposed to have naturally. Your hair required constant maintenance. Once a week, you set it in curlers, sitting under a hairdryer hood for an hour. You touched up the style every night, sleeping on uncomfortable rollers to preserve the waves. If you went to a salon, a luxury, you sat under industrial-strength dryers while hairdressers teased, sprayed, and shellacked your hair into submission. And the pressure wasn't just internal. Other women judged you constantly. At PTA meetings, at church, at the grocery store, you were being evaluated. Was your lipstick fresh? Was your hem straight? Had you gained weight? Were you letting yourself go? The competition was silent but vicious. Every woman was a potential threat, someone who might look better than you, tempt your husband, prove that you weren't good enough. Your husband contributed to the pressure, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly. "You look tired today," he'd say, which really meant, "You should be wearing more makeup." Or he'd comment on another woman. "Mrs. Peterson always looks so put together," which really meant, "Why don't you?" If you gained weight after pregnancy, he'd suggest you watch what you eat. If you wore the same dress too often, he'd ask if you needed new clothes, implying you looked shabby. But here's the cruelest irony. All this effort, all this maintenance, all this desperate striving to stay attractive, it was never enough. You could look perfect and he'd barely notice. You could diet until you were skeletal, and he'd still glance at younger women on the street, because the game was rigged. The standards were impossible. And the real goal wasn't for you to succeed. It was to keep you trying, keep you insecure, keep you convinced that your value depended entirely on your appearance. So you kept curling your hair, applying your lipstick, sucking in your stomach, smiling through the exhaustion. Because stopping, even for a day, felt like admitting defeat. and defeat meant losing everything. Suburban life was supposed to be paradise, but for many women, it was isolating. Your husband was at work all day. Your children were young and demanding. Your neighbours were friendly but superficial. You had no career, no financial independence, no outlet for your ambitions or frustrations. You were alone, surrounded by people, slowly losing yourself. The suburbs stretched out in every direction. Rows of identical houses with identical lawns, identical cars in identical driveways. It looked perfect from the outside, clean, safe, orderly. But inside those houses, behind those cheerful painted doors, women were quietly suffocating. Your husband left for work at 8 and didn't return until 6. 10 hours. 10 hours alone with children who couldn't hold a conversation, who needed constant attention, who drained you emotionally and physically. You loved them, of course you loved them, but they weren't company. They were responsibility. You had no adult conversation during the day, no intellectual stimulation, no one to talk to about ideas, feelings, frustrations. The television kept you company, soap operas droning in the background while you folded laundry. But it wasn't real connection. It was just noise filling the silence. The neighbours were there, physically present, but emotionally distant. You'd wave to Mrs. Anderson while hanging laundry. You'd chat with Mrs. Miller at the mailbox. Superficial exchanges, weather, children, sales at the grocery store. Nothing real, nothing deep. Because admitting unhappiness, admitting loneliness, admitting that this perfect suburban life wasn't enough, that was taboo. Everyone was performing. Every woman on the block was pretending to be happy, fulfilled, content. You couldn't be the one to break the illusion. So you smiled, you waved, you kept your struggles private, and they did the same. All of you isolated, together, close enough to touch but miles apart emotionally. You had no friends, not really. Not like you'd had in high school or college. Those friendships had dissolved when you got married, when you moved to the suburbs, when your life became consumed by housework and childcare. Your old friends were scattered, living their own isolated lives. You exchanged Christmas cards maybe, but you never saw each other. And even if you wanted to make new friends, how? You couldn't just leave the house. You had children to watch, meals to prepare, cleaning to do. And going somewhere meant getting everyone dressed, packing a diaper bag, loading kids into the car. By the time you managed all that, you were too exhausted to socialise anyway. The car was a cage of its own. You had one car, and your husband took it to work every day. You were stranded. Couldn't go anywhere without his permission, without coordinating schedules, without proving the trip was necessary. Grocery shopping was your only regular outing, and that was a chore, not freedom. Some days you didn't speak to another adult at all. You talked to your children, don't touch that. Eat your lunch. Time for a nap. But that wasn't conversation. That was management. You talked to yourself sometimes just to hear a voice, just to remember you were still a person capable of forming sentences. When your husband came home, you were desperate for connection. You tried to tell him about your day, but what was there to say? I did laundry. I made dinner. The baby cried. It sounded trivial, boring, meaningless, and he was tired from his day, uninterested in domestic minutiae. So you learned to stop trying. You asked about his day instead, listening, nodding, performing interest. At night, lying in bed, the loneliness was worst. He'd fall asleep immediately, exhausted from work. You'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there was. If this was what you'd been preparing for your entire life. If this was the happiness you'd been promised. The isolation did something to your mind. You started to doubt yourself, your worth, your sanity. Were you being dramatic, ungrateful? Other women seemed fine. Other women seemed happy. Maybe the problem was you. Maybe you just weren't cut out for this. Maybe you were broken. You had no outlet for your intelligence, your creativity, your ambitions. Those parts of you withered. You'd once had dreams, becoming a teacher, a writer, a scientist. But those dreams were locked away now, gathering dust like the books on your shelf that you never had time to read. The suburbs were supposed to be community, but instead they were rows of isolated women, each one trapped in her own house, her own routine, her own quiet desperation, close enough to wave, too far to save each other. When the loneliness, the pressure, and the monotony became too much, doctors had a solution. Tranquilizers, Valium, Milltown, Mother's Little Helper. Pills to numb the anxiety, the depression, the quiet desperation. No one asked why you were unhappy. They just medicated you and sent you back to your kitchen. You'd been feeling off for months. Not sick exactly, but not well either. Anxious, sad, overwhelmed. You couldn't sleep, but you were always exhausted. You snapped at your children. You cried for no reason. You felt like you were drowning, but there was no water, just the endless sameness of suburban life pressing down on you. Your husband noticed finally. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, not unkindly. "Maybe you should see a doctor." It wasn't concern exactly, more like mild irritation. You weren't performing your role properly, and that affected him. So you went to the doctor. You sat in the examination room in your nicest dress, makeup carefully applied to hide the dark circles under your eyes. The doctor, middle-aged, male, wearing a white coat like a costume of authority, asked what was wrong. You tried to explain. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the feeling that your life was slipping away, that you were disappearing into the role of wife and mother, that there was nothing left of you. You stumbled over the words, worried you sounded crazy, worried he'd dismiss you. He did, sort of. He didn't laugh or call you hysterical, that would have been too obvious. Instead, he nodded sympathetically and said, "It's very common. Many women struggle with the demands of homemaking. It's stressful, raising children, keeping a home." He made it sound reasonable, normal even. Then he pulled out his prescription pad. "I'm going to give you something to help you relax. It'll take the edge off." He scribbled something and handed you the paper. "Valium, 5 milligrams. Take one twice daily as needed for anxiety." You stared at the prescription. "Is this safe?" you asked. "Perfectly safe," he assured you. "It's just a mild tranquilizer. It'll help you cope. Many of my patients take it. You'll feel much better." He didn't ask about your life, your circumstances, your support system. He didn't suggest therapy. That was for crazy people. He didn't recommend changes to your routine, your workload, your isolation. He just gave you pills and sent you on your way. You filled the prescription at the pharmacy. The pharmacist barely glanced at you. Apparently this was normal. Routine. Just another housewife picking up her tranquilizers. The first pill went down easy. Within 30 minutes, you felt different. The sharp edges of anxiety dulled. The crushing weight of sadness lifted slightly. You didn't feel happy, exactly, but you felt less anxious, less sad, less everything. It was a relief. So you took them regularly. One in the morning after your husband left for work. One in the afternoon when the children napped. They helped you cope, helped you smile, helped you keep going through the motions of your life. But they also made you foggy. You forgot things, appointments, errands, conversations. You moved through your days, in a haze, functional but not present. You were there, but you weren't really there, and that was the point. The pills didn't fix your problems. They just made you care less about them. Your neighbours took them too. You discovered this at a coffee gathering when Mrs. Peterson mentioned she'd just gotten a refill. "Oh, you're on Valium too?" another woman said. "Me too. It's a lifesaver." They discussed dosages, side effects, which doctors were most generous with prescriptions. It was as casual as discussing recipes. Tranquilizers became the secret language of suburban housewives. Mother's Little Helper, they called it, borrowed from a Rolling Stones song. A joke, but not really. Because these pills were keeping them afloat, keeping them functional, keeping them from completely falling apart. Your husband noticed you were calmer. See? The doctor fixed you right up, he said, pleased. He didn't ask what the pills were or why you needed them. He just appreciated that you were back to normal, smiling, cooking, cleaning, not complaining. But you knew you weren't fixed. You were medicated. There was a difference. The problems were still there. The isolation, the lack of purpose, the suffocating routine. The pills just made you numb to them. And numbness, you discovered, was close enough to happiness in 50s America. Doctors prescribed these pills by the millions. They were cheap, effective, and kept women functional. Keep the housewives happy, or at least quiet, and the system ran smoothly. No one questioned whether the system itself was the problem. They just kept writing prescriptions, and you kept taking them. Because what else could you do? You couldn't change your life. You couldn't leave your marriage. You couldn't pursue a career. You couldn't even admit how miserable you were without being told you were ungrateful, dramatic, hysterical. So you swallowed the pills, smiled through the fog, and kept going. The dishes still needed washing, the children still needed feeding. Your husband still needed dinner on the table at 6. The pills didn't change any of that. They just made you care a little less that this was all your life would ever be. So tonight, as you drift off in your world of choices and possibilities, maybe take a moment to think about them. Those girls in the 50s who never got to choose. The ones who spent their childhoods practicing for a role they didn't audition for. Who learned to cook, clean, smile, and disappear before they even knew who they were. They survived home economics classes that taught them their worth was measured in biscuit fluffiness. They endured etiquette lessons that trained them to take up less space, speak more softly, exist more quietly. They memorized the rules of a game rigged against them from birth. Be pretty but not vain, smart but not threatening, ambitious but only for a husband, capable but only in service. They were groomed, and that's the right word, groomed, to become perfect housewives, fed a steady diet of magazines, advice columns, and societal pressure that told them marriage was the ultimate achievement and motherhood was their destiny. They were handed toy ovens and baby dolls and told this was practice for real life, for the only life that mattered. And then they lived it. They moved to identical houses in identical suburbs and performed identical routines. They woke before dawn to put on makeup before their husbands saw them. They cooked 3 meals a day from scratch. They cleaned, laundered, ironed, mended, organised, managed, and smiled through the exhaustion. They hosted dinner parties where they were judged on their pot roast and their posture. They gave birth and were expected to bounce back, to be grateful, to find fulfillment in the endless, invisible labour. When they felt empty, they were told they were ungrateful. When they felt trapped, they were medicated. When they had ambitions beyond the kitchen, they were called selfish, unfeminine, unnatural. Their dreams were filed away like old recipes, acknowledged once, then forgotten. But here's what's remarkable. They survived. More than that, they resisted. In small ways, quiet ways, ways that didn't always have names or recognition. They read books that validated their discontent. They whispered truths to each other in grocery store aisles. They took night classes and part-time jobs despite the judgment. They asked dangerous questions. Why am I so unhappy? Why isn't this enough? Is there something more? And eventually those whispers became conversations. Those conversations became movements. Those movements became change. Not overnight, not easily, but it happened. Because those women, the ones trained to be perfect housewives, refused to let their daughters live the same script. They were brilliant. They were capable. They were so much more than the role allowed, and their resistance, their refusal to accept the lie that housewifery was fulfillment, that paved the way for every choice you have today. So tonight, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to those women, the ones who smiled through the performance while quietly planning the rebellion, the ones who kept their textbooks even though they'd never use their degrees, the ones who took Valium to cope with a life they were told they should love, the ones who survived the training and still managed to pass down something better, a spark of resistance, a question mark, a possibility. They didn't get to choose, but they made sure you could. And that stubborn, brilliant, heartbreaking act of love, that's the real legacy. Not the casseroles or the perfectly set tables or the flawless dinner parties, but the cracks they put in the facade. The truth they whispered to their daughters, the future they fought for even when they couldn't fully imagine it. History remembers them as housewives, but they were so much more. They were survivors. They were resistors. They were the generation that said no, quietly, at first, then louder, so that you'd never have to live inside that cage. Sleep well tonight. And if you dream of a girl in 1953 sitting in home economics class, learning to hem a skirt and thinking quietly, dangerously, there has to be more than this. She was right, and because of her there is.